I used to believe that if you dressed the part, smiled the right way, kept the conversation lively, you could will happiness into existence. That night, sitting across from Daniel at the rooftop restaurant, I realized how wrong I was. The city glittered beneath us like spilled jewels, 1,000 tiny promises that life could still be beautiful. Fairy lights crisscrossed above our heads, their soft golden hum barely touching the heavy, aching space between us. I wore the black dress he had once called his favorite. Simple, understated, a second skin. I had taken care to pin my hair the way he liked, leaving a few loose tendrils to frame my face. Lipstick, jewelry, even the perfume at the hollow of my throat, all chosen for him. For this night, our 10th anniversary. Daniel was charming as always, in the way someone recites a script they've long since stopped believing in. He complimented the wine, smiled dutifully when I mentioned memories from our early years. He reached across the table once to squeeze my hand, but his fingers felt slack, distracted. His phone buzzed against the linen tablecloth for the third time, a small, insistent vibration. He flinched slightly before silencing it, offering a tight smile. "Work," he said, barely meeting my eyes. I nodded, pretending to believe him. Pretending was easier. Pretending was survival. When he excused himself to the restroom, he left, his phone behind, face down. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe somewhere deep down he wanted to be caught. The phone buzzed again, and this time, despite the tremble in my fingertips, I reached for it. The screen lit up. "Can't wait to feel you tonight. Same hotel?" From Samantha. Samantha. His coworker's wife. The woman who hugged me too long at Christmas parties, who asked too many questions about our marriage under the guise of friendly concern. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, ugly sound. For a moment, I thought I might faint. The restaurant spun, fairy lights blurring into cruel constellations, and I steadied myself with both hands on the table's edge. I rose, moving blindly toward the restroom. My heels clicked against the marble floor, too loud, too fragile. Inside the restroom, under the cold, ruthless lighting, I faced myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the woman Daniel married. She was smaller somehow, worn at the eye edges. There were fine lines around her eyes now, lines he had once traced lovingly with his fingertips. I touched my throat, where the perfume still lingered, a gift from Daniel 2 anniversaries ago. The scent of memory and mockery. I could feel it then, a splintering deep inside me, a cracking open. Not rage, not even heartbreak, not yet. Just the slow, suffocating certainty that I had been living inside a story that was no longer mine. Thought about going back to the table, smiling, pretending again. A final performance before the curtain fell, but something inside me, some ancient, stubborn part, whispered, "No more." I leaned in close to the mirror, studying my own eyes. They were glassy, yes. But underneath the tears, there was a spark, a thread of steel. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my dress. I would go back to that table. I would finish the dinner. I would let him play his part a little longer. Because tonight, I needed to see it all. Needed to feel every hollow gesture, every manufactured word, so that when I finally walked away, there would be no doubts left. Tonight would not end with tears in a restroom stall. It would end with the first quiet steps toward a life that belonged to me. I turned off the faucet without washing my hands. I didn't want to rinse away the touch of truth. As I pushed, opened the door and stepped back into the golden hush of the restaurant, I felt it for the first time, a flicker of something fierce, not hope. Not yet, but the possibility of it. When the waiter brought the dessert, a delicate chocolate soufflé with a flickering candle stabbed through its heart, I smiled politely and whispered a thank you I didn't mean. Daniel raised his glass, a hollow toast to many more years together. I clinked my glass against his and tasted the bitterness of wine and the ash of everything unspoken. As I chewed mechanically through the sweetness, memories began to slip in like rising floodwater, impossible to hold back. I used to believe our love was rare, that kind of stitched-together battlefield bond that only lucky souls found. Our wedding day felt like living inside a dream I was terrified to wake from. I wore ivory lace, carried a bouquet of wild peonies, and laughed so much my cheeks ached. Daniel had looked at me like I was the only thing that existed. I remember the way he tucked a loose curl behind my ear at the altar and whispered, "You're my forever." I believed him. God, how I believed him. In those early days, he made me feel invincible, like I could conquer cities, paint masterpieces, fly. I spoke often, too often, of my dream to open a little art gallery on Main Street. A sun-filled space, with brick walls and paintings hung like prayers. Daniel would grin and say, "Of course you will, Liv. You're brilliant." But little things began to shift, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was harmless suggestions. Maybe we should save more before you start your gallery. You know, the city's not safe. Let's stay here in the suburbs. It's better for our future. Do you really need to hang out with Melissa so much? She's a bad influence. Advice, just advice, wrapped in concern, sealed with a kiss. Listened. Because love meant listening. Right? One by one, I put my dreams away like delicate porcelain, wrapped carefully and stored for later, though later kept slipping further out of reach. My friends noticed before I did. Melissa pulled me aside one night after dinner, before Daniel had fully isolated me from the people who once knew me best. Her voice was quiet but fierce. "Liv, you're disappearing. You're not you anymore." I laughed it off, hugged her too tightly, promised we'd catch up soon. We never did. Daniel didn't forbid me from seeing her. He didn't have to. He just frowned slightly whenever her name came up, and I, desperate for peace, began leaving her messages unanswered. He made it easy for me to betray myself. Money, too, became a silent tether. We combined accounts, as married couples often do, but somehow Daniel ended up managing them all. It was more practical, he said, less stressful for me. I agreed, relieved to avoid the arguments that always followed when I questioned him. Remember the day I stopped painting? I didn't even notice at first. Weeks had turned into months. My easel gathered dust in the garage, canvases still stacked in the corner where I had left them after the move. The dream that once felt so alive in me, bright and pulsing, had withered into something I was almost too ashamed to name. Every now and then, I'd open the bottom drawer of my dresser and find the keychain Daniel gave me when we first moved in together. A tiny silver paintbrush charm, now tarnished and forgotten. I'd turn it over in my hand like a relic from a different life, wondering if that version of Olivia still existed somewhere. I gave myself so many reasons to stay. He works so hard. He provides for us. Every marriage has rough patches. I just need to try harder. I became fluent in the language of excuses, but even the strongest dam can only hold back the flood for so long. There were nights when he came home late, the scent of someone else's perfume clinging faintly to his shirt. Nights when he turned away from me in bed without a word. Mornings when he kissed my forehead instead of my lips, as if I were something fragile and finished. And still, I stayed. Not because I was weak, though I thought so at the time, but because when you pour every piece of yourself into someone, walking away feels like dying. I thought love meant loyalty. I thought loyalty meant endurance. I didn't realize, not yet, that sometimes loyalty to someone else becomes betrayal of yourself. As I pushed the last bite of the soufflé around my plate, My wedding ring glinted under the soft light. I twisted it absently, a habit I hadn't noticed before tonight. The tiny diamond caught the glow from the fairy lights above, flashing like a signal flare. It was Daniel who picked out the ring. "Simple," he said. "Elegant. Nothing too loud. Just like he wanted me to be." The waiter returned to clear the plates, and I smiled at him. A real smile this time, edged with something sharp, something awake. Outside, the city waited. Vast, unapologetic, untamed. And somewhere, beneath the ruin of the life I had built with Daniel, the woman I had once been was stirring. I returned to the table with a smile stitched so tightly across my face it felt like it might crack. Daniel was already halfway through his second glass of wine, scrolling idly through his phone like a man, with no obligations in the world. He looked up when he noticed me, offering the same well-worn grin he reserved for polite acquaintances. "You okay?" he asked, a little too casually. I nodded, sliding back into my chair, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "Fine," I said. "Just needed a moment." A lie, like all the ones I had told myself for years. The rest of the dinner passed in a slow, suffocating haze. I answered his questions. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold my hand across the table, even as every fiber of my body screamed at the contact. I memorized every flicker of his face, every hollow word, burning them into my mind like a brand. I wanted to remember. I needed to remember, so I would never be tempted to rewrite the past with softer colors. The city lights spun lazily outside the window, blurred by the rising mist. Somewhere far beneath us, life continued, oblivious, indifferent. When the check came, Daniel paid without hesitation, adding a generous tip and flashing a smile at the waitress. That same easy, charming smile he once reserved only for me. I followed him out of the restaurant, the ring on my finger feeling heavier with every step. In the elevator, as the doors slid shut, he reached for me, pressing a kiss to my temple. I closed my eyes and let him, feeling nothing but the sharp, cold blade of betrayal carving a hollow inside me. The drive home was silent, save for the soft hum of the tires against wet asphalt. Rain had begun to fall, light at first, then heavier, until the windshield wipers worked in frantic rhythm against the downpour. At home, Daniel mumbled something about an early meeting and disappeared into the bedroom. I heard the muted thud of him dropping his shoes by the door, the rustle of clothes being shed. I stood in the living room, soaked in the dim glow of a single lamp, feeling like a ghost in my own house. The air smelled faintly of my perfume, the one he said made me smell like memories. Now it just smelled like mockery. I sat down on the couch, pulling my knees to my chest, and stared at nothing for a long time. The silence pressed against me, thick and unbearable. After a while, I rose, slow, deliberate, and padded barefoot to the bedroom. Daniel was already asleep, sprawled across the bed without a care in the world, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that once brought me comfort. Now it made my skin crawl. I reached for his phone where it lay on the nightstand. No password change, still arrogant, still assuming I would never look deeper. I hesitated for a breath. Then I opened it. The first thing that greeted me was another message from Samantha, then another from a woman I didn't recognize, then another, and another, threads of conversation, photos, hotel receipts, separate accounts on apps I didn't even know he had. Entire parallel lives unfolding in the palm of my hand. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding a hollow beat against my ribs. The betrayal wasn't just one woman. It was dozens of tiny deaths. Lies layered so thickly they no longer tried to hide. I wanted to scream, to smash the phone against the wall, to shake him awake and demand explanations he would never give. Instead, I placed the phone gently back on the nightstand and turned away. I pulled a small overnight bag from the closet, the same one I had used for our weekend getaways. My hands moved on autopilot, a pair of jeans, a sweater, a toothbrush. I tucked the old silver paintbrush keychain into the side pocket without thinking, a lifeline to a girl who once dreamed of more. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. The rain had become a torrent by the time I slid behind the wheel of my car. Water pounded the roof like 1,000 desperate fists. The streets were rivers of reflected neon, blurring and shifting with every turn. I drove without direction, without destination, my fingers clenched white-knuckled around the steering wheel. Somewhere past the city limits, where the buildings thinned and the darkness thickened, I found a lonely stretch of coastline. A battered public beach access sign loomed out of the rain like a ghost. I pulled over and killed the engine. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out at the churning sea. The world outside was a canvas of grays and blacks, the horizon lost in mist. Waves slammed against the shore in furious, relentless rhythm, the same way grief battered against my chest. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and let the sobs tear free. Ugly, gasping, broken sounds. Grief so thick it felt like drowning. Cried for the woman I used to be. I cried for the years I could never get back. I cried because even now, a small, treacherous part of me still loved him. The rain seeped through the cracked window, chilling my skin, but I barely noticed. Time became meaningless, just the endless beat of water against glass, the thrum of my own broken heart. At some point, maybe minutes, maybe hours, the sobs slowed. The silence crept back in, but this time, it didn't crush me. I lifted my head and looked out at the sea. The storm was breaking. The rain softened into mist. The clouds began to shred apart, revealing patches of bruised sky. And there, impossibly faint, but real, I saw stars. Shivering and exhausted, I opened the door and stepped out into the wet sand. The ocean wind tore at my clothes, whipped my hair into my face, but I stood there, staring up at the stars that had outlasted the storm. I was still breathing, tattered, battered, broken, but breathing. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized breath was enough. Didn't have a plan. I didn't know what came next, but standing there, under the scattered light of a wounded sky, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not how my story would end. I found the cottage 2 towns away from nowhere. It sat on the edge of a misty lake, its roof sagging slightly, the white paint on the shutters peeling like old scars. A for rent sign swung crookedly from the front gate, creaking whenever the wind stirred. The woman who showed me the place, Mrs. Callahan, barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. She handed me the keys with a shrug and said, "It leaks a little when it rains. Stove works if you're patient. It's quiet, though. Real quiet." That was all I wanted. Quiet. I moved in with nothing but the small overnight bag I had packed the night I left Daniel. A few clothes, my old sketchbook, a battered copy of The Awakening that had somehow survived every move, and the silver paintbrush keychain that now felt heavier in my pocket than gold. The first nights were the hardest. The cottage groaned and sighed like an old woman settling into bed. The radiator hissed fitfully. The pipes clanged when the wind howled across the lake. Sometimes I woke gasping from dreams, not of Daniel, but of the version of myself I had lost. Dreams where I was, running through endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a stranger's face back at me. I ate little. Canned soup, crackers. Whatever I could summon the strength to heat up. I spoke less. Days would pass without the sound of my own voice filling the empty rooms. Loneliness wasn't the worst part. It was the emptiness. The realization that I had wrapped my entire identity around someone who hadn't thought twice about shattering it. One morning, after another sleepless night, I found an old cracked flower pot on the front porch. Impulse drove me to the tiny general store in town. I bought a handful of herb seeds, basil, thyme, rosemary. Not because I had some grand gardening plan, but because I needed proof that something could still grow. I knelt in the damp soil, pressing the seeds into the earth with trembling fingers. Dirt caked under my nails. My jeans grew stained and wet at the knees. I whispered to the seeds, a secret bargain between us. If you grow, maybe I can too. The days blurred into a rhythm of small, stubborn acts. I scrubbed the kitchen until the sink gleamed, repainted the battered cabinets a soft, defiant yellow, hung clean linens over the warped windows. Each act was an argument against the version of myself that believed I wasn't capable, wasn't strong enough. One rainy afternoon, while rummaging through a box of things I had thrown into my car, I found my old sketchbook. The pages were yellowed at the edges, but the binding was intact. My hands shook as I opened it, tracing the faded pencil lines. Wildflowers, stormy skies, faceless women wrapped in cloaks of smoke. Without thinking, I grabbed a pen and began to sketch. The lines were harsh, angry at first, jagged strokes, cutting across the paper like scars. I didn't care. I filled page after page, a woman breaking chains woven from gold, a house crumbling into the sea, a heart stitched clumsily back together. There was no plan, no audience, no need for approval, just me. And the paper. And the truth I had been too afraid to speak aloud. A few days later, a soft knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, a woman stood on the porch holding a steaming pot covered in a crocheted cozy. She was small and sturdy, with a thick braid of silver hair and a smile so genuine it made my throat tighten. "Name's Eleanor," she said, thrusting the pot into my hands. "Chicken stew. You look like you could use a real meal." I blinked at her, stunned by the simple kindness. "Thank you," I managed, my voice rusty from disuse. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just gave a brisk nod and walked away, her boots crunching across the gravel path. After that, she came by sometimes, dropping off fresh bread, old novels, potted violets. She told me stories about her late husband, about the decades they spent in this town, about the time she punched a man who called her sweetheart without permission. With Eleanor, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to explain the ghost that lived behind my ribs. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight on my chest began to lift. One morning, I woke before sunrise and wandered down to the lake. The mist curled off the water in delicate ribbons. The world was silver and still, like a held breath. I stood barefoot in the cool, dewy grass, watching as the first rays of sun broke through the trees. Something shifted inside me, something fierce and tentative all at once. Healing wasn't a grand cinematic moment. It wasn't loud or certain. It was the quiet rebellion of planting seeds in broken soil. The trembling courage of drawing a line on an empty page. The quiet miracle of choosing to stay. I wasn't whole yet. Maybe I never would be. Not in the way I once imagined. But I was here. I was growing. And for the first time in years, I realized that survival wasn't just about clinging to the wreckage. It was about building something new from the ruins, something wilder, something freer, something that belonged only to me. There's a peculiar kind of silence that comes after the storm. Not peaceful exactly, but electric, charged with possibility. That was the silence I lived in now, not the brittle, terrified silence of my old life, tiptoeing around a man who mistook control for love. This was the silence of rebuilding. Began filing for divorce 3 months after I moved into the cottage, quietly, deliberately. No warning. No drawn-out confrontations. I found a lawyer named Hannah Green, a woman with a sharp voice, a sharper mind, and a glint in her eye that told me she had fought wars of her own. When I sat across from her in her cozy office, walls lined, with law books and a tiny cactus perched stubbornly on the window ledge, I didn't tell her everything. I didn't have to. She listened carefully as I spoke, taking notes in neat, economical handwriting. When I mentioned Daniel's financial control, the accounts I had no access to, the money that seemed to disappear, she leaned forward slightly. "Do you still have access to any of the joint documents?" she asked. I thought of the old laptop gathering dust under the bed, of the folder labeled Household, where Daniel used to store bills, tax forms, receipts he assumed I never looked at. A flicker of anger stirred in my chest, not the wild, consuming rage from before, but something colder, cleaner. "I do," I said. Her smile was small but approving. "Good. Let's start there." The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of uncovering, cataloging, preparing. I spent long nights hunched over the battered kitchen table, sifting through old files, my fingers stained with ink and dust. And what I found? It went deeper than betrayal. There were hidden accounts. Funds transferred quietly into Daniel's name alone. Credit cards opened without my knowledge. Debts tied to my signature. Forged so cleanly it was almost admirable. It wasn't just infidelity. It was theft. He hadn't just betrayed my heart. He had bet our future on his lies, gambling recklessly with my trust, my name, my very life. But instead of breaking me, the discovery steeled me. Each piece of evidence was another stone in the foundation of the life I was rebuilding. Each hidden transaction was another nail in the coffin of the woman who had once believed love could survive anything. In the middle of all this, something unexpected happened. I began to paint again. Not pretty landscapes or careful portraits, but raw, furious images that poured out of me faster than I could tame them. A woman with a hollowed chest stitched together with thread, a house crumbling, into the sea, flames licking its edges, a tree growing defiantly from a broken ribcage. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply let the truth bleed onto the canvas. It wasn't about making something beautiful. It was about making something honest. The first time Eleanor saw one of the paintings, a piece I had titled The Hollowing, she stood silently for a long time, her arms crossed over her chest. Finally, she said, "You should show these." I laughed. "Who would want to see this?" She shrugged. "Someone who needs to know they're not alone." The idea lodged itself in my mind, stubborn and persistent. Gallery exhibit, not for profit. Not for approval, for freedom. I found a small art collective downtown, a renovated warehouse turned exhibition space that welcomed new artists. They were running a local showcase 2 months out. Open submissions, no theme. I gathered my pieces, more than I realized, and gave them a title, The Versions of Her. Each painting told a story. Each stroke was a chapter, the girl who believed, the woman who doubted, the hollowing, the rage, the rebuilding. When I sent in my submission, I expected nothing. When the acceptance email came 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. Not because I needed validation, but because for the first time in years, I had created something no one could take away from me. Meanwhile, Hannah built our case with methodical precision. We prepared everything quietly. No bombshells. No warnings. Let him keep believing I was broken. Let him keep underestimating me. It would make the truth hit harder when it finally came. The night before the exhibit opened, I stood in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by my paintings. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and turpentine. Strings of warm lights crisscrossed the ceiling, casting soft halos around each canvas. I wore a simple black dress, not for Daniel this time, but for me. At my throat, instead of perfume, I wore a small silver pendant Eleanor had given me, a delicate wildflower pressed between glass, a symbol of what survives. I walked slowly through the space, studying each piece. Each woman on the canvas stared back at me with fierce, haunted eyes. I was all of them, and none of them anymore. At the far end of the gallery, tucked into a quiet corner, hung my final piece. The Leaving. It depicted a woman, walking away from a burning house, carrying nothing but a broken paintbrush and a handful of wildflowers. Her face was turned away. You couldn't see if she was crying. You couldn't see if she was smiling, because it didn't matter. She was walking away, and that was enough. Standing there, surrounded by the wreckage and the rebirth of my own making, I realized something simple and profound. My pain was real. My love had been real. But my pain would not define me. I wasn't erasing the past. I wasn't pretending it didn't happen. I was choosing what pieces I carried forward. Daniel had written himself out of my story the night he chose betrayal over loyalty. Wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I was seeking truth. And truth, I realized, was the purest freedom there was. 1 year later, almost to the minute, I found myself standing outside the same rooftop restaurant where my world had shattered. The city glittered beneath me again, but it no longer looked like a world I couldn't reach. Tonight, it looked like a kingdom I had already begun to conquer. I wore a simple, deep green dress that skimmed my frame. Nothing extravagant, nothing desperate. Around my neck, the silver wildflower pendant Eleanor had given me gleamed softly. Against my skin, a tiny defiant badge of survival. My wedding ring, once a heavy shackle, sat in a small velvet pouch tucked into my clutch. I hadn't worn it in months. I had almost forgotten the weight of it. Almost. Inside, the restaurant had changed little. Fairy lights still glittered overhead. Soft music curled through the air like mist. Waiters in black ties floated between tables with practiced grace. The center of the room, one long table was set, its white linens crisp, the crystal glasses catching the candlelight. Daniel was already there. He sat at the head of the table, wearing his favorite navy suit, his smile easy and smug, the same smile he had used to charm boardrooms, strangers, and me. For a moment, just a moment, I watched him from the doorway. He looked exactly the same, and I felt nothing. Not hate. Not love. Not even anger. Just a clean, hollow space where once he had lived inside me like a second heartbeat. The guests arrived slowly. A curated group of friends, family, former colleagues, people who had seen our love story from the outside, but never understood the rot within. They smiled politely, exchanging hugs, commenting on how lovely the evening was, how wonderful it was to see everyone again. I smiled too. The waiters moved in perfect choreography, serving wine, offering appetizers. Then, at precisely 7 o'clock, the first envelopes appeared, small, cream-colored, unassuming. One placed gently in front of each guest. Daniel frowned when he noticed them, a wrinkle forming between his brows. Took my seat at the opposite end of the table, smoothing the napkin across my lap. Silence fell as the guests opened their envelopes, confusion shifting into disbelief, then shock. Inside each envelope was a carefully curated dossier, copies of messages, screenshots of financial records, photographs, proof of every lie, every theft, every betrayal Daniel had woven into our lives. There was no rage in the room, no shouting, just the heavy, suffocating silence of truth finally dragging its carcass into the light. Daniel's face blanched. His hands, always so steady, trembled slightly as he reached for his own envelope. He flipped through the papers once, twice, as if disbelief could alter the facts written there in black and white. I stood then, slowly, calmly. The soft rustle of my dress against the floor seemed louder than the music. All eyes turned to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply spoke. My name, I said, voice steady, is Olivia Whitmore. Some of you know me as Daniel's wife. Some of you know me as a quiet fixture at his side. Invisible. Agreeable. I let the silence stretch, let it settle into the bones of the room. For years I traded pieces of myself for the illusion of love. I gave up dreams, friendships, trust, because I believed loyalty would be enough. I met Daniel's gaze then. He looked cornered, small. But loyalty, I said softly, means nothing when it is not returned. I lifted the velvet pouch from my clutch and placed it carefully in the center of the table. The wedding ring rolled out with a soft, final clink, spinning once before coming to rest. I am not here to scream. I am not here to weep. I smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I am here to tell the truth. I turned to the guests, some looking away, some unable to tear their eyes from the slow-motion ruin unfolding before them. I was betrayed, I said, not just in love, but in trust, in legality, in spirit. And tonight, I am no longer carrying that betrayal in silence. Daniel opened his mouth, some protest, some excuse, forming too late on his tongue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing it. Without another word, I stepped away from the table. The waiters, bless them, moved as if choreographed, holding the doors open for me like I was a queen leaving a court of pretenders. I didn't rush. I walked through the restaurant with my head high, the silver pendant at my throat, catching the light like a tiny star. Behind me, Daniel's voice cracked the silence, pleading, pathetic. But I didn't turn around. I had heard every lie he had ever told. There was no music left to dance to. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. The city spread out before me, vast and endless and full of unseen roads. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, hands steady on the wheel, and turned the key. As I pulled away from the restaurant, I glanced once into the rearview mirror. The rooftop glittered against the sky, a fragile constellation. For a moment, it almost looked beautiful, but I knew better now. Some lights only look bright because they are burning themselves out. I turned up the radio, and a song from my childhood, something wild and free and half-forgotten, flooded the car. I smiled, not a performative smile. Not a smile for anyone else, just for me. The road stretched ahead, endless and unwritten, and for the first time in years I realized I wasn't leaving broken pieces behind. I was leaving ash. I was leaving ruin. And in its place, I would build something no one could ever take from me again.